Friends, you asked me to review Oppenheimer, and I'm just back from having seen it, and I'm delighted to do so. I guess the first thing I'd like to say is that the film itself is magnificent. The screen is stretched so that the figures in it are longer than they normally are. And even in close-ups, the figures stretch across the screen. Not that they aren't attractive as they appear, they are, but their significance is clear. And the power, historical and entertainment power of this film is magnificent. Cillian Murphy should definitely win an Emmy. Excuse me. He should definitely win an Oscar. He has earned it. A magnificently underplayed role, and with the expressions in his face convey his emotions magnificently. The film itself is colossal in its scope and size and grandeur. A great film and a great piece of history. I think there's an Oscar for it too. Interestingly enough, it does not begin with young Oppenheimer at the beginning so that you get a story of that sort. Rather, it begins with his tragic rejection by Congress in the early 1950s, when, under the inspiration of Joe McCarthy, the great liar and investigator who claimed there were communists here, there, and everywhere, Congress was trying to find communists to oppose. Oppenheimer, by that time, had realized that the destructiveness of this bomb, which killed perhaps somewhat more than 200,000 people in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, he realized that that monstrous set of murders, perhaps the first on Hiroshima was necessary, but the second on Nagasaki seemed to him unnecessary. And indeed, subsequent historians have said there's a good chance that the dropping on Nagasaki was a warning to Russia. In any case, he was investigated because he opposed the creation of a hydrogen bomb, which Edwin Taylor, another great physicist, became the father of. He opposed it. And why? Well, he opposed it because he felt blood on his hands. We'll deal with that in a little while again. But from their point of view, was he a commie? Well, he was certainly a left of center person. He did send money to the Soviet Union early on, not for the purpose of supporting the country, but for the purpose of supporting the Jews against whom terrible things were being done by Stalin, a monster, perhaps having killed more people than Hitler managed to kill, including people in the Ukraine. But let that rest for now, though there's a war going on there now. The film starts with that investigation. And Oppenheimer, having gone through all that we will see him going through as the film proceeds, is crestfallen. unable to make them understand what his positions are and why his positions are. He is opposed by Mr. Strauss, who would like to use isotopes in his business, and he is somewhat opposed by Edwin Tereler, who became the father of the hydrogen bomb. He doesn't feel that greater destruction serves a positive purpose. And so the film begins with those investigations and then slides back into the young man who goes to England to study theoretical physics and is told there that he ought to go to Germany where there's greater work being done, goes there and meets Heisenberg, one of the great physicists of the time, and indeed receives his PhD there, and then goes back to teach at Berkeley, where he's a magnificent instructor, gets a splendid following, and develops a great reputation as a theoretical physicist, having published important work. And then World War II occurs. And in this film, Einstein, among others, realizes that Germany, with Heisenberg there, is probably working to develop an atomic bomb. And so informs President Roosevelt. And President Roosevelt decides that indeed there should be a Manhattan Project formed. That's going to be the title of it, a group of nuclear physicists who will work with Einstein's discoveries back in 1905 when he was 24 years old, that E equals mc squared. The energy produced by a tiny amount of mass is that mass, m, times the speed of light squared. Oh, immense. Indeed, Oppenheimer is the lead physicist of a group of brilliant physicists, all of them working to develop that idea. How fission can be caused to replicate itself over and over until an immense explosion occurs. They do that work. It's closely followed in the film. There are arguments. There are people who disagree. Oppenheimer brings them together, manages to cause them to function as a whole despite their disagreements, and they magnificently succeed. They are overseen on one level by the military, youngish general who wants to be sure that they're loyal to the country. Oppenheimer asked him, how much trust do you have? I trust zero. He wants to be sure and is convinced. And the investigations go forward. They find what they need and ultimately test the bomb on a deserted area of New Mexico. They call the bomb trinity. Why that was so is up for grabs. Oppenheimer once said that he named it that thinking of John Donne, whose poetry obviously contains religious elements, his later poetry. In any case, the bomb is developed, it's tested in New Mexico, it explodes immensely, unbelievably, with a power that seems capable of destroying the world. Indeed, in some sense, it has been destroying the world. We have those terrible isotopes around and they're causing lots of trouble. But let that rest for the moment. The test is a success. Everybody embraces everybody else, overjoyed by what? The destructiveness of this entity. Unfortunately, perhaps in quotes, the event takes place after Germany has given up in World War II. So the attention of the American government is turned to Europe. To Asia, to Japan. And Harry Truman decides, the President of the United States, that it should be dropped on Hiroshima, and is. The ground is devastated. Perhaps 200 people, 200,000, people killed, together with Nagasaki. And then, after being dropped on Hiroshima, it's dropped on Nagasaki, and Oppenheimer can't understand that at all. The first display doubtless convinced Japan that it should surrender. Indeed, historians, many of them, think that it was dropped on Nagasaki as a warning to Russia. We have lots of these. Be careful. The Soviet Union at the time. In any case, it changes Oppenheimer's mind about what he undertook. He feels that he has blood on his hands and visits Harry Truman, who welcomes him, thinking, oh, there's the guy who led the group. It's just terrific. And Oppenheimer, instead of being full of joy, is sad, feels guilty, tells Truman that he has blood on his hands. Truman takes out his handkerchief and hands it to Oppenheimer and says, you don't have blood on your hands. I have blood on my hands. Well, Truman's perspective was, if it took war to defeat Japan, and we would have defeated Japan in the war, but Truman's perspective was, if it took war, it would have cost 200,000 American soldier lives. So he saw it as costing the enemy's people about what it would have cost America in human life. And since Japan was guilty of starting the war, we were innocent in ending it. You don't have to agree with that, but you have to recognize that it's the thought of a relatively intelligent and very accomplished man. In my opinion, one of the accomplished presidents in the history of our country. — leave out the question of whether he should have dropped that second bomb. Well, dear friends, I expect Oppenheimer to go down in history as a great film about a great man and the tragedy of his life. Indeed, after his fall from grace, Oppenheimer became the director of the institute at Princeton where Einstein was working. And at that time, he met Einstein and had discussions with him. A wonderful element in his life, not that it made up for what he lost. And indeed, in his loss, I think, what our country lost. Thank you for being with me. We'll talk about Barbie next.